The NÍSP program was born out of an understanding that our freshwater fish species are, in decline, right? And then a need to provide resources for community and hapu to be able to determine on their awa where to find inanga, where to find their spawning spaces, and how to protect and enhance those areas. And out of the National Inanga Spawning Program was born the Northland Inanga Spawning Habitat Restoration Project, NÍSP is the acronym, which is what I manage now, which is sort of a more boots on the ground approach, so using the resources that had been developed through the NÍSP program, and to find those areas on the awa to detect where they were, to protect them, and then enhance them. And so that's what the NÍSP project's been doing, along with our hapu partners and our collaborators from the Regional Council, Department of Conservation, to get out there and map those areas where the inanga are spawning. I guess the first thing, what are inanga? So inanga are a species of freshwater migratory fish that make up a large portion of the whitebait catch. So in any bucket full of whitebait, about 90% of them are made up by inanga. So they make up the vast majority of the whitebait catch. The whitebait themselves, the whitebait run, is made up of, depending where you are in the country, up to 6 migratory species, the juveniles of up to 6 species, that being the giant kōkapu, banded kōkapu, kōaro, shortjaw, inanga, and the common smelt. The first 4 are all endemic to New Zealand, so only found in New Zealand. Inanga are found throughout the southern hemisphere, as are smelt. But you often catch the juveniles of other fish in the whitebait catch too, bullies and things like that. Sometimes glass eels are caught in there too. It's all kai. Their numbers are declining. Their numbers are declining through habitat loss, for the most part. It potentially is overfishing as well, but the whitebait fishery is unregulated. Apart from there being a short season, you can take as much as you want. So, but no one's really sure, because there's no historic records of inanga or whitebait catch over time. So we don't know if those catches are declining, but the assumption would be that they are. So, inanga are the smallest of the whitebait species. They only grow up to around about 110 to 120 mil. 6 whitebait species, 5 of them are galaxids, known as galaxids, and they're all migratory freshwater fish. Migratory in that they spend part of their time in the freshwater and part in the salt. They're named after the giant kōkapu and this patterning on its back that represents or looks much like the sky, galaxy, galaxids. That's where they get their name from. You guys probably get to see most of these around. Up in Northland we see lots of bandies, lots of inanga, and if we're really lucky and get invited up into the bush, we get to see some shortjaw, some kōaro. But historical kōrero is that giant kōkapu used to exist in the far north, but they haven't been there for a while. We've lost in Northland about 98% of our wetlands. So our giants being a wetland specialist, so without their habitat, we're not likely to see many around. So the life cycle of whitebait. Adults spend about 6 months of their life in coastal waterways, not far from the moana, where they are feeding on terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates, take on a lot of energy, produce gonads, eggs and sperm, and in the late summer months, early autumn through winter in Northland, they swim downstream in schools to a point in the river where they meet the salt water coming in on the high tides, where they then lay their eggs in the riparian margins. Those eggs live above the high tide mark for about a month. Then the next tide comes in, eggs are washed out to sea. They spend between 3 and 6 months out at sea, where they're eaten by just about everything out there. And in the springtime, they start schooling towards the coast, where they start sniffing out a freshwater source, and then they swim upstream and the cycle starts again. To the best of our knowledge, inanga are an annual species. They live for 1 year. So the adults spawn and they die. Not often, but occasionally when we are looking for eggs, you smell the dead fish before you find the eggs, and you start looking in the grass and you find the adults, and then you'll start finding the eggs around them. That's if the rats and the mice don't get to them first. Bandeds, giants, koaro and shortjaw, they all do their thing up in the bush. So, and on the riverbanks also. So all these 5 species all lay their eggs out of water. It's part of the life history of these fish that makes them pretty remarkable. And so they do it, but very, very little is known about those other 4. There's a young dock technician that's doing some shortjaw work in the Waipawa on the west coast of the far north lately, and she has discovered and filmed caught on film spawning of shortjaw up in the bush for the first time, and then consequently on film caught the rats coming in and eating all the eggs. So yeah, very little's known about that, but we assume that they're laying their eggs in the leaf litter during flood events, which seems to be a very dangerous habit. If you can't predict a flood, right? You can predict a tide. The inanga, I think, have nailed it. They know the tide's coming every month or twice every month. The other 4, yeah, that's where you'll find your koaro and your shortjaw is right up there in the bush line. Yeah, without the leaf litter and things like that, I don't think they're spawning. I think that there is maybe some evidence that they can lay their eggs in the gravels on the river, but I think most of the evidence is pointing towards they're spawning on the riverbanks. How far up the catchment you are, because that would determine how much how much water flow you'd get during a flood. From the images that I've seen of this Fern Donovan's work up in the Waipawa, they're not far from the river's edge, and they're actually just in mosses and lichens on boulders that are this far from the normal river flow. So there's just boulders here. There's a tidal push, a storm push. They're swimming up. They may even be climbing. I don't know. As long as that substrate is staying moist, the eggs are probably surviving. They are good climbers. They may climb up. I don't know. I really just don't know enough about those ones. But certainly inanga are motivated by tide. About 2 weeks they develop eggs, so sometimes when you're searching for them, they're looking back at you. I always think that's pretty cool. So this is deep down in the root mat, what we call the root mat. So they need really dense, dark, thick habitat to lay their eggs in. So you're on your hands and knees digging down right down to almost down to the soil, and these are sitting down there. So shaded from UV, nice and moist. And then when the next tide comes in, these eggs are washed out and almost immediately hatch into a larvae that are 6 or 7 mil long, and for a little while they still have a yolk sac. They're incapable at this stage of consuming too much, but then once they get out into the moana, then they start to eat plankton, phytoplankton and zooplankton. And this is what you would see when they're coming back up in springtime, what you would call whitebait. That's probably a mixed school. There's potentially all of the species in that photo. It's hard to tell them apart when they're they're that size. Mostly the fins will tell you. So in some parts of the country, down in Canterbury, the inanga are spawning, and all it's done is done in a space of a month, 5 or 6 weeks. So you would expect that in the sort of 3 to 6 months later, potentially 6 months later, the cooler the water, the slower they grow, so the longer they're staying in the moana. But you will get pulses at different times. In Northland, our spawning goes from April to October. We've detected them spawning in October. So because our moana's a lot warmer, our season's a lot longer, so they're not all coming in the beginning of September. We'll keep seeing schools, November, December, January, February. So a reference here, they're about 1 millimetre in diameter, so they're pretty small. Needle in a haystack. You could walk across the awa from bank to bank on the backs of the whitebait, right? And now you're seeing schools of hundreds. So inanga, which were probably in their trillions, and whatever number comes after trillions, are probably only in their millions in our waterways now. The basis of the food chain in the awa and in the moana, so as whitebait out there, they're getting eaten by the kōhero, by the jack sprats, by the kahawai, by the tāmuri, so it's a major source out there in the moana. In the awa, the tuna, the mullet will chase them right up. The mullet will come right up with the tides as well in our awa up north. I don't know if you guys see that here, but they come right inland. They're chasing them. The shags are in the water. The kōtari are there. Everyone's feasting on them. So with them declining, there's a major food source for all the other taonga species that rely on them for around breeding. Patuhara Kiki look after the fairy tern population up on the east coast, Waipu way, and they're having to help fledge the young taraiti, and they will only take inanga. They've tried feeding them gambusia, which is that pest fish that we see around, and other sprats and things, but they will only take inanga. And you know how many breeding pairs of taraiti are around? Dozens, right? This looks like a river near you. River, sea, spawning habitat. So obviously depending on the gradient of your river, this is representative of that area on a river where those high tides, that pulse of salt water comes in upstream. So generally speaking, saltwater wedge on those high tides, saltwater being more dense, it pushes up the river, depending on the river of course, in a wedge like this. So freshwater layer on top. So we get out there in our kayaks with our salinity meters, and we're trying to find that point here where you've got a little bit of salt water on the bottom and then fresh above, and then we will start searching the banks either side of that for a few hundred meters either side. So that's the area on the awa, and sometimes that can be 50 meters in stream from the river mouth. In some of the awa that we're working on in Bream Bay on the Ruakaka, for instance, that's about 8 kilometres inland that salt will push, really low-lying, low gradient rivers. The saltwater wedge and the tidal shift are not the same thing necessarily, because the salt comes up and backs the fresh water up. So you can, even though the leading edge of the saltwater wedge might be here, the fresh water still backs up, so you still get a tidal shift further inland. Yeah. Northland, a really good indicator for us is where, if you were going to be visiting an awa for the first time, you would look on a map and see where the mangroves finish. And usually that will indicate that's around about where the salt stops. The other thing is crab holes. They start to diminish above the high tide salt mark as well. So if you've got those crabs here, that's a good indicator too. I mean, there may be other indicators too. You know, some of the carex species, some are fresh tolerant, some are salt tolerant, so you might see a transition there. Where do your wee and your oi start? Where does your puree start? That they might indicate. If you don't have mangroves, make it a lot harder than up north.
Eggs in all those three? Wee, oi, poo.
Yeah. If they're in the right zone, yeah. Look, we don't get a heck of a lot of those sorts of species on the awa that we're working on. We're putting those species back as part of our restoration efforts. We're seeing inanga spawning mostly in kaikuyu and Mercer grass, but I've seen them spawning in alligator weed. Do you guys get that down here? Alligator weed, I've seen them spawning under blackberry bushes, you know, as long as it's dark and damp and there's a habitat there. They're programmed, right? They've got 1 year to do what they've got to do. They'll release them somewhere in less than ideal conditions sometimes. The restoration of inanga spawning sites is a difficult one to justify sometimes. Because oftentimes what we're finding is that we're getting good spawning in kaikuyu, right? And they're really small zones, and if we're going to go in there and start replacing the kaikuyu with a native species, you are in some instances disrupting a site that's already working really well. So it's just something that my team is only just starting to play with. Historically, our restoration around inanga spawning zones has been riparian planting. So we're putting harakeke, tukoka, pureri, kowhai, you know, those big, that's mostly about, you know, reducing runoff, stabilising banks so that we know that those spawning zones are going to survive the next flood, those sorts of areas. That's how we've targeted most of our restoration planting. We're just starting to think about moving into transitioning those sites into natives by putting native seedlings of wee, oi, carex, puree, toi, stuff like that in there. But, you know, there's potentially a catch-22 there where you change the environment and it may not be the environment that an unfortunate incident last year on an awa where we had a farmer that was really keen to work with us, and we talked through the restoration plan, and farm manager sprayed the kaikuyu right down to the water's edge, right along the strip where we were finding millions of eggs. We came back to do a saltwater wedge survey, paddled around the corner, and this entire strip was mud from the fence line to the awa. And so we dived in there. We action stations and planted oi, wee, puree, toi, all those natives in there, and the place looks amazing. See if I can find some before and after photos for you all in a single year. And but we're yet to find any spawning in the natives. We were finding lots and lots of spawning in the kaikuyu that was there before, and now that we've got natives in there, we haven't found any eggs there. So don't know. We don't know if it's a success yet. But in other instances, I think we'll just do a staged approach. We'll just do patches in and around these currently existing spawning sites and just see what happens. Although we know that the saltwater wedge is an important indicator of where inanga will start to spawn, there are very, very specific local conditions that are calling inanga back year after year after year, and we don't know what those are. Right? So just to put some context around that, sometimes we'll find after a rainfall event that our saltwater wedge is 5 or 6 kilometres downstream of our normal saltwater wedge, right? Normal being, normal flow events. But the wedge is all the way down here, but the inanga are still spawning in the same site that they did the month before when the saltwater wedge was here, in the same site they were the year before and the year before and the year before. So regardless of where the saltwater wedge is from month to month, they're still picking this site. So the saltwater wedge is important for a sort of a broader geographical area, but then there's something that's calling the inanga back to those sites over and over and again, and we don't know what that is. It may be scent-based, potentially scent-based.
Observing a spawning event up in the shallows on the edges, and the kahawai were coming right up, so the top half of their body was actually out of the water, and just smashing them as they were spawning.
Often we'll find spawning in these areas. If the saltwater wedge happens to push to here, these little where a trib and a main flow meet, that's a really good spot for them. Into those marshlands and stuff, no, I think generally speaking, marshlands, it depends what your definition of marshland is. If it's wetland, yes. Coastal wetlands, probably a little bit too salty. But wetlands, no, we don't have a lot of wetland to search. Wetlands are really hard to search in anyway. We just have to assume that the wetlands that are there, if they're in the right place, that they'd be spawning in them. Because historically that's where we assume that they were spawning. Just to touch on that, the whole wetland idea, we had a wānanga last year where we got some sort of wetland experts come along and that are developing wetlands, artificial wetlands in these areas. And so you can take a small area of an awa like this that probably would have had wetland all around it now, but it now has, cows munching the grass right to the river's edge. You create a wetland here and create a wetland here, and you can massively increase the available spawning area. So that's something that's happening a bit nowadays too. So that's something to think about too. We call this area the love zone, guys. That's where all the love's happening. So these are what we need to see: the right mix of fresh and salt water, the right bank access, the right vegetation, the right time of year, and the right tide levels. This right bank access, through the work that various inanga and freshwater ecologists have seen, is that a bank angle anywhere between 7 degrees and 20 degrees is perfect. So there's enough slope on there as the tide comes up. You get a good amount of access with emergent species coming out of the water and all those sorts of things. So that's a 90-degree bank where the tide just comes up. Even if it might lip over the top, is probably not as good a site as a nice sloped bank where the tide can slowly creep up. And this is the perfect scenario, right? Big native trees creating shade, enough shade, not too much shade, tall thick grasses right up the back here that they can lay in, that are nice and tall, stay nice and moist. That's where you'll find the eggs. And then these emergent ones that sit between the high tide and the low tide, so that they've got something to swim through and keep out of the way of the kotari and stuff. What do we got here? Predators, introduced predators. Yeah, okay. Snails and slugs, mice, we know for sure. Mice and rats are eating them. And even trout will be eating the inanga as they're coming up too. So. I said this earlier, the decline is mostly through habitat change, right? Classic scenario, nice beautiful banks here, good slope, a bit of shade, good grass cover, but the cows will get in there. The cows are creating all of this too, all of this slumping, this bare land through here. This would be beautiful too. There's enough of a slope there, but it's been denuded. They're crapping in the awa, they're eating the grass, they got to go. Stuff around all the time, potentially, this once upon a time had these beautiful graded banks here. This might be in the love zone, but they can't spawn on a wall, so. We do use hay bales as an artificial spawning habitat. temporary artificial spawning habitat. I mean, in the look, if this was in your area and this was your awa, and the council had these banks there, and this was in the love zone, I'd be asking them to move them. This is not good. This is not good enough, you know. Yeah, I mean, in the urban environment, you'll see. Like our Auckland team, most of their awa are flowing through backyards, you know, house after house after house, and people mow the lawns right down. So ask them
You
to.
don't want short grass, you want nice long grass.
Nice long grass, as long as you possibly can. Sedimentation is a problem, obviously, after storms. We saw that after Gabrielle. I think pretty much the entire country wouldn't have seen a lot of inanga spawning last year. All of our spawning sites in Northland were all just covered in a foot of sediment after Gabrielle. And then we had a couple of storms after Gabrielle too, right? That came through and just compounded the problem. Barriers, we all know about barriers. Inanga are really poor swimmers and not at... They're okay swimmers, they're poor climbers, they can barely climb at all, and even rapids will stop inanga if they're too long and too fast. So, you know, they can't access potential spawning sites or adult habitat if there are barriers in the way, like that, you know. So this is a hay bale installation. So if you've got a habitat that's currently you know, not suitable, this looks like it's either been grazed or even mown, we go and throw a couple of hay bales in, and what you'll find is the inanga swim in between the two bales. You leave them maybe an inch apart, or I try and tilt them together slightly. So there's about an inch at the bottom and closed at the top, and the inanga just swim in and spawn just directly on those internal surfaces. Something I've been playing around a bit with lately as well is if there are dead branches and things or something I can grab on the side of the awa, put them down underneath the hay bales, lift the hay bales off the ground by an inch, so that offers another opportunity for them to swim underneath and spawn. So you can do that. If you think there's a spot where they could be spawning but the habitat's not right and you want a, you know, proof of concept or presence absence type study, put those in, go back and check them after a high tide, peel them apart, see if there's eggs there, and then say to the farmer, look, they want to do it here, let's get a fence in. Because at the very least, a fence will do a lot. I mean, this grass will eventually thicken up. Unfortunately, these attract mice as well. If you're going to do this, I'd highly recommend putting some traps around. You open these up, the mice scuttle out, you've got no eggs. The pooks like to rip them apart too. Sometimes we cover them in chicken wire, stop the pooks from ripping them apart. And then eventually, you know, whatever grasses are there will come back. You can augment with riparian planting. Ask authorities to review their maintenance strategies around mowing, remove tide gates, fix barriers.